All right, so this is joint work as, thank you very much for putting us onto the program. This is joint work with Mary, Fatih, and Ayşegül. So inflation has recently surged. CPI inflation reached 8.9% in June 22, its highest reading since November 1981. And this behavior of inflation has been very different from some of the experiences in recent expansions. And we try to illustrate this here in this diagram. So here we plot the growth in core CPI over the course of an expansion. On the x-axis is the number of quarters since unemployment peaked in the preceding recession. And on the y-axis is the core CPI growth. And so what we show here is that in the 1970s expansion, core CPI grew by about 17% or so over 10 quarters. In the following expansions, core CPI grew slower and slower. So in the 80s expansion, the 90s expansion, early 2000s expansion, and then finally the expansion that started in 2009, where core CPI had grown by only about 5% or so after 10 quarters. The current expansion is very different, and that's been tracking much more the 80s expansion than any of the more recent expansions. And this strong growth in prices was led in particular by the goods sector. And we illustrate this here. On the left panel, we see core goods, and on the right side, we see core services. And we see that core goods prices initially surged in the current expansion, surpassing even the price growth of goods in the 70s expansion, while services price growth was much more moderate and only recently picked up and is now tracking the 80s expansion. This behavior, where inflation was led by the goods sector, is very different from some of the recent expansions, like here the 2009 or the 2003 expansion, where goods prices basically were flat and the entire price growth came from the services sector. Several developments have contributed to this strong price growth on the goods side. So on the supply side, there have been supply chain disruptions leading to an increase in imported input prices in particular. And there was a decline in the willingness to work, leading to a rise in the reservation wage by about 20%. And so these factors have contributed to increasing input prices and increasing wages, as we show in this table. So here we're showing the annualized growth rates of import prices and wages in the last 4 expansions. And highlighted is the current expansion on the very right. So in the first row, we see that import prices have been growing at an annualized rate of about 6%. And if you look at the import prices of so-called industrial supplies, such as metal, chemicals, rubber, and so on, inputs into the production process, these have actually been growing at an annualized rate of 20% in the current expansion. In addition to that, wages have been increasing, as measured by the Employment Compensation Index here. We see that that has been rising at an annualized rate of about 5%, 1 to 2 percentage points faster than in earlier expansions. Finally, domestic intermediate input prices have also been rising, kind of reflecting that both foreign competitors' prices as measured by import prices have been rising, and domestic production prices have been rising as well. In addition to these supply side factors, there have been shocks to the demand side. There was a quick recovery in labor demand and a pickup in consumer demand due to pent-up demand after the lockdowns and fiscal stimulus, as well as a shift towards goods from services that has led to a rise in the goods share in consumer expenditures from 36% to 38%. So there's been a lot of recent work that's trying to understand this current inflation episode and to disentangle some of these supply factors and demand factors. What we bring to the table is that we examine this recent surge in inflation through the lens of a two-sector New Keynesian model that will allow us to illuminate some of the equilibrium effects and equilibrium relationships and to do counterfactuals. So we do 3 things. So first, we're going to focus a bit on the supply side of this previous table that I showed you. We're going to analyze the role of labor supply shocks and supply chain disruptions. We're going to show that these import price and labor supply shocks contributed about 2 percentage points to the rise of inflation, about 1/3 to 2/3 of the pickup in inflation overall that we've seen. Importantly, the interaction of these shocks to import prices and labor supply had an amplified effect, increasing inflation by 0.6 percentage points relative to a world where these shocks hit separately. Next, we turn to the effectiveness of monetary policy, and we consider demand shocks that increases inflation also by 2 percentage points. And then we compare the implications of the supply shocks versus the demand shocks and what they imply for monetary policy. What we're going to show is that aggressive monetary policy is very effective when the shocks are on the demand side, but much less effective when the shocks are coming from supply side factors. Finally, we turn to some regression evidence, and you use aggregate and industry level data to provide some corroborating evidence for the mechanisms of our model. So let me start briefly summarizing our model. So our model is a standard New Keynesian DSGE model with wage and price rigidity, with kind of 4 key departures from like the plain vanilla DSGE model. So first we have 2 sectors, goods and services, and these sectors differ in their labor share and their consumption share. Moreover, firms in the goods sector compete with foreign competitors in the output market, whereas in the services sector, there's no foreign competition, all competition is domestic. Second, there are 2 inputs into production, labor and intermediate inputs. And intermediate inputs can either be domestically produced or imported. So this production structure gives rise to rich substitution patterns. When the price of imported intermediates goes up, firms are going to substitute towards domestically produced intermediates and towards labor, and this is going to drive up inflation. Third, there's a finite number of domestic and foreign producers, meaning that there are strategic interactions between firms and incomplete pass-through. So when foreign producers experience a cost shock, this is going to allow domestic firms to raise their prices by relatively more because they're not going to lose as much market share towards these foreign competitors, so they can expand their markups. And finally, there's going to be a time-varying expenditure share on goods to capture this rise in the goods share that we see in the data. So we're going to calibrate this model using standard parameters from the literature. And let me focus here on 2 key parameters that we focus on. So the first one is the elasticity of substitution between labor and intermediates. So this is important because when there's a shock to these intermediate inputs, firms are going to substitute towards labor, and the strength is governed by this elasticity of substitution. So we're going to set this to 2 in the goods sector and to 1.5 in the services sector based on some recent work by Chan in Danish data that has estimated these elasticities to be in the range of 1 to 3. Second, the elasticity of substitution between domestic and foreign intermediates, which we also set to 2 based on some work by Feenstra and co-authors that finds a range of 1 to 3 for this elasticity. And we analyze the robustness of our amplification results to different parameter choices in the paper. Our main exercise is to study the effect of labor supply and supply chain disruption. So our model is solved in Diner using a 3rd-order approximation to capture nonlinear effects. And we're going to operationalize these shocks as 3 joint shocks that happen simultaneously. First, there's a labor supply shock that is asymmetric. It increases the disutility of labor, more in services than in goods, to kind of capture the pandemic experience of these sectors, and to match the 0.3 percentage point decline in labor supply relative to the trend from Hobain and Shahin's work. Second, there's a shock to imported input prices of 16% to kind of match the observed rise in imported input prices that we see in the data. And finally, there's a foreign competition shock, so that increases the marginal cost of foreign competitors. And we calibrate this to match the roughly constant share of imports in GDP. So foreign firms didn't really gain market share as US firms were affected by these shocks. So they must have experienced kind of somewhat similar shocks. Let me just hide this again. Okay, so we feed these joint shocks into the model. And let me show you a couple of impulse responses to show you what the model generates. So here we show impulse responses of labor demand and domestic input demand. These are deviations from steady state. And we see that as a result of this combined shock, firms substitute away from imported intermediates towards domestically produced intermediates and towards labor. And this effect is in particular strong in the goods sector because intermediates are a more important input for goods. As a result of these shocks and this substitution, there's a rise in the real wage in both sectors, and real marginal costs go up as a result. Consequently, there's wage inflation. We find about 3.5% wage inflation in both sectors. And there's consumer price inflation of about 2%. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is about 1/3 to 2/3 of the inflation pickup, depending on whether you look at 21 or 22. What are the key takeaways from this exercise? So there's 3 key insights that we take away from this. So the first one is the substitution effect. So an imported input price shock, so a supply chain shock on its own, can actually generate substantial wage and price inflation. Let me illustrate this here with these two diagrams. So on the left, we have average wage inflation averaged across the goods and the services sector. And on the right, we have price inflation. And we find that the 16% imported input price shock on its own generates 0.5% wage and price inflation. Intuitively, when imported input prices rise, firms substitute towards domestic production factors. This drives up demand for domestic labor, and this increases wages. The second insight is that a shock to foreign competitors also raises domestic inflation. So now we feed separately into this model just the foreign competitor shock, and we find that it generates roughly similar wage and price inflation. Why is this? Well, when foreign competitors' prices rise, consumers substitute away from buying from foreign firms towards domestic firms. This again drives up domestic demand. And domestic firms now have greater pricing power. They can increase their markup because they're not going to lose as much market share to foreign firms. And again, this increases prices. Finally, a joint shock has an amplified effect on inflation. So let me show you this with a couple of diagrams. So first, I'm just going to feed in separately the third of the shocks, the labor disutility shock. So these are these three lines, show the three shocks separately. And let me just add up these separate shocks. So just basically adding up these impulse responses. That's this red dashed line. So what happens if we feed these three shocks jointly into the model? Well, then we get to the black line, and clearly this black line is above the red line. And so the difference is what we call the amplification effect. So this joint shock raises wage inflation by 1 percentage point and price inflation by 0.6 percentage points more than the three separate shocks. What's the intuition? Well, when both wages and input prices go up at the same time, it becomes less effective to substitute across these inputs to blunt this cost increase. Firms can't really substitute from inputs towards labor or vice versa to reduce their cost pressures. And again, consumers can't really substitute towards foreign suppliers to reduce their costs. And so as a result, prices are going to go up by more. What are the implications of our model for monetary policy? Well, there's been a lot of debate about what monetary policy should do, and in particular, when the source of the shock is uncertain. So we've talked about the supply side, about supply-driven inflation of 2 percentage points. But what if this inflation came from the demand side? We're going to study an exercise where inflation also rises by 2 percentage points on impact, but not because of supply shocks, but because of demand shocks. So we feed into the model a goods-favored demand shocks that shifts expenditures towards goods from services and boosts consumption today because of a reduction of the discount factor. And we're going to analyze our baseline scenario with the standard Taylor rule versus an aggressive policy where the interest rate rises more and earlier because of a less persistent Taylor rule and higher weight on inflation. And we're going to study the implications of this aggressive policy when the shocks are supply-driven versus when the shocks are demand-driven. So let me start with the kind of supply shocks. So here I'm showing you the impulse responses of consumption, labor demand, and price inflation to the baseline in black and the aggressive policy in red dashed. So first we see that under the aggressive policy, consumption, which already contracts in the baseline, contracts substantially more. So there's a recession in this case. Labor demand is actually very strong and positive in the baseline. This is again because of the substitution towards domestic labor. So the labor market actually overheats in response to the supply shock. Here, the aggressive policy reduces this, but the labor response is still positive in this case. So there's no unemployment or less employment, if you will. And finally, price inflation obviously comes down. So intuitively, higher interest rates in the case of the supply shocks, they deal with inflation, but they reduce demand. And so in this case, consumption actually contracts substantially. The picture is very different in the case of the demand shock. So again, the demand shock generates similar inflation of around 2% in the baseline scenario, and this is obviously reduced with more aggressive policy. However, consumption was also too high because this was the demand shock, consumption was overheating. And so here, aggressive policy is kind of good. It brings consumption down, which moderates inflation. And additionally, a recession later, if you follow this black line, there's actually a recession in labor demand and also in output. This recession later is actually avoided. And so this is kind of standard classic textbook, basically with aggressive policy, the higher interest rates deal with both higher inflation and this overheating consumption by bringing both more in line with kind of the baseline. Okay, in the final couple of minutes, let me try and present some corroborating evidence for our findings. So the model generates increasing marginal costs and amplification in the recent period. So do we see any support for these claims in the data? So we're going to look at two data sets. First, an aggregate data set where we run some local projections following Jordan to trace out impulse responses. And second, some industry level data. We run panel regressions for about 500 6-digit NAICS industries. So let me start with the aggregate analysis. So here we just run local projections of producer price inflation in some quarter T plus H on the left-hand side, on input price inflation and wage inflation, as well as up to 8 quarters of lags on the right-hand side. And so we run this regression for age from 0 to 20 to trace out impulse responses over this period, 1988 to 2022. And for both input price inflation and wage inflation, we find the age with the highest correlation, so kind of the peak of the impulse response function. And then for that age, we're going to see whether these parameters vary over time by rerunning this regression over 25-year rolling windows. So this is kind of the peak response. So let me show you what this looks like. So here on the left, we show the peak response of PPI inflation to intermediate price inflation. Where now on the x-axis, we have the end of this 25-year rolling window period. So this is kind of the gamma H coefficient over time. And so we see that this correlation between input price inflation and producer price inflation has been coming down, but then recently it has picked up in the recent period. So this pass-through has been increasing. The picture is similar for wages. Basically, there was no wage to price pass-through in the 2000s, as we've documented in an earlier paper. But wage to price pass-through has significantly picked up recently. It's kind of jumped up and become positive again. So there's been this reemergence of wage to price pass-through. What about this interaction effect? So we can add an additional interaction term to our regression, as well as additional lags for this term. And we can trace out this impulse response function for age between 0 and 20. And so this is how the impulse response function of this looks like. We see a nice hump-shaped impulse response. So this interaction term has a positive and significant effect, meaning that inflation is higher when both wages and input prices go up at the same time. So that's very helpful. We now turn to industry level analysis because we want to also control for some aggregate effects that may be going on. So the time series analysis, we can only look at these aggregate effects, and maybe there were changes in expectations, other aggregate things. And so with industry level data, we can actually look at within industry variation to see if our mechanisms hold. So we run a similar regression where on the left-hand side, we put 4-quarter producer price changes in some industry I. And we regress this on 4-quarter changes in input prices, wages, foreign competitors' prices. So these are the import prices of an industry. So if I is the car industry, these are the imported prices of imported cars. And we control for productivity. And finally, we control for industry fixed effects and these time fixed effects to take up any aggregate trends. So we run this regression and we look whether things are different in 2021 compared to the earlier kind of pre-COVID period. So what do we find? So we estimate these kind of pass-through coefficients, and let's focus first on this orange term, which is input price changes. So we find that this correlation between input price changes and producer price changes was about 24% before COVID. But in the COVID period, this has picked up to the sum of these two coefficients. This pass-through has risen to about 40%. Similarly, the wage to price pass-through has risen from basically near 0 to about 13%. And finally, producer prices have become more correlated with foreign competitors' prices. This correlation has also strengthened. And I should point out, this is we're focusing here on the goods sector in this analysis. The second thing is we can look at the interaction effect. So we can add an interaction term to this regression, just as before, and some additional nonlinear terms that come out of a second-order Taylor expansion. And what we find is that this interaction term is strongly positive and significant. So again, we find strong support for the fact that when both input prices and wages go up at the same time, there's a stronger effect on inflation than when they go up separately. And in fact, once we add this interaction term to the regression, these individual interactions with 21 become insignificant, kind of indicating that this pickup in pass-through that we see is completely accounted for by this interaction effect. So let me conclude with our key takeaways. So we have 4 key takeaways. So first, we can interpret these supply chain disruptions that we've seen as a partial reversal of the disinflationary effects of globalization that we have enjoyed over the last couple of decades or so. Second, we find that part of the tightening of the labor market could just be due to supply chain disruptions that have led to a substitution towards domestic production. Third, the joint import price and wage shock had an amplified effect on inflation. And finally, the benefit of aggressive policy depends really on the source of the shock. So for the demand-driven shock, it's advantageous to be ahead of the curve and to be aggressive, but aggressive policy is much less advantageous for the supply shock. Thanks very much. That's it, actually.